How do you fare, my loyal 9 patriots? Thanks for joining us in episode 2 of the Communist Hit List. If you missed episode 1, we went over public enemy number 1 for the communist, which was General Patton. So if you missed it, make sure you check out the link below. And if you have time, pick up some Invader coffee with the discount code I have for you guys below. So let's get started. So a lot of you might be asking is, who is James Forrestal? And I'll have to admit, I didn't know exactly who he was or all the pieces about him until I started researching these connections that I started finding. So without going too deep, let's just kind of cover the basics. Forrestal was a naval aviator during World War I, never saw any action, never saw any combat, remained stateside. He achieved the rank of lieutenant, and after the war, he later on moved to Wall Street, and that's where he became very successful, which ultimately gave him the financial freedom to successfully give back to his country and to selflessly give back to his country. He did this by becoming a Secretary of the Navy during World War II and being part of the $1 a year club, which is a club that only accepts $1 a year in payment because they just have enough money to sustain themselves. They don't need the government money. Then at the height of his government career, Forrestal actually became the first ever Secretary of Defense, which was created by the Truman administration. Now, with all that success, what if I were to tell you that James Forrestal killed himself? It's kind of hard to believe, right? To help answer this question properly on why he killed himself or quote unquote killed himself, let's examine Forrestal's actions during World War II and post World War II, because what he did created a lot of enemies for him. Forrestal was often regarded as a smart, business-savvy kind of guy who was just no nonsense. He didn't accept the political games. And during his tenure, and up until his death in 1949, he was known to be the most anti-communist person in America. And this is for good reason, because Forrestal respected how he grew up. He grew up in poverty, and he winded up becoming incredibly successful. A true rags to riches story, and he wanted that for every American. It's safe to say that much like Patton, McCarthy, and many others, they saw the true threat to America, and that was communism. Communist Russia was the true threat to America, and Forrestal wanted to be a step ahead in every aspect, especially in the military. However, after World War II, Truman completely disagreed with people like Forrestal and started a complete annihilation of the US military. And if we just look at the Truman policies that he was implementing, he was more concerned with having a relationship with Stalin and downsizing the US military rather than maintaining military and economic strength, things that are necessary to be a global superpower. Truman was so destined, he was so gung-ho to reduce the military strength and size, and that quite literally supplies that were needed overseas to service members, they were literally being thrown overboard into the ocean. And supplies back in the United States, trucks, vehicles, all those things, they were allowed to deteriorate and just be improperly stored. This really frustrated and angered Forrestal, not only from a business and fiscal standpoint, because that was Forrestal's background, but because Forrestal felt that the United States had lost Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a lot of other Eastern Bloc countries. He was concerned that a lot of other countries are going to start following suit. It's almost as if Forrestal knew how bad things were going to get, both on the home front in America and globally. Forrestal researched the true nature of communism, the philosophy, the policy, and he came to the conclusion that democracy and capitalism could not coexist. But what did we see in those times? A lot of people, especially Truman and many other presidents and people in government, they would say that communism and capitalism could coexist. They could work together. But Forrestal, he knew that was not the case. Forrestal saw the insight of what was going to be happening in the future with this communist takeover. Just look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Forrestal obviously didn't live to see that, but he knew those types of actions would happen. Vietnam, these communist infiltrations into governments, these proxy wars that were happening. And Forrestal was definitely not wrong about future potential attacks. Not just infiltration in the government, but actual kinetic attacks. If you ever have time, look up the invasion by missiles story, where hundreds of briefcase-sized nuclear weapons were deployed all across the United States by the KGB, waiting for the message for detonation. Obviously, Forrestal wasn't alive for that time, but again, it goes back to him having the foresight. It's almost as if Forrestal was clairvoyant because he knew how bad this communist infiltration was going to be and what was going to be the result of that infiltration. So at this point, you might be saying, so what? Forrestal was an anti-communist, no big deal, so were a lot of other people back then. But the thing that highlights the reason for his death is the amount of people that were against Forrestal. The news media, for example, really hounded Forrestal, really wrote a lot of negative smear papers and campaigns, journals, anything you can think of, trashing Forrestal. Later on, we find out that those same people that were producing those articles and journals, they were communist, or they were communist sympathizers. And it doesn't just stop with the news media. So many people in government were against Forrestal, and even the President of the United States was against Forrestal, which again painted a target on Forrestal's back. And this is part of the story with James Forrestal that gets really interesting and really starts raising a lot of red flags, and that's his death. His death deserves a whole nother video in itself, but we'll go ahead and just do a brief summary. The official story of his death is that he committed suicide by jumping out of the window of the Bethesda Naval Hospital from the 16th floor. However, all the facts looking at that case, they don't make sense. There's a lot of holes in the story that have not been filled and will never be filled. If we just look at how he was brought to the Naval Hospital, he was apparently in Florida doing some R&R where he quote-unquote attempted suicide, where then that story was later contradicted by the doctor that was with him. Then they flew him to the Bethesda Naval Hospital. While he was en route to that hospital, Forrestal attempted many times to get out of the vehicle while it was in motion. You have to think, how scared or how nervous was Forrestal about going to the Bethesda Hospital? Did he know something? Because even when he got to the Bethesda Hospital, he even said to the driver, "I'm not getting out of here alive." And that's not the first time Forrestal was concerned about his life or weird things that were happening around him. Forrestal told Bob Lovett, who became the Secretary of Defense later on, "Bob, they're after me." And just weeks before his death, Forrestal was even complaining of being followed by quote-unquote Zionist Asians or communist/men in black. And that's not even the strangest part to the story. If we just look at Forrestal's treatment in the hospital at Bethesda and the events leading up to his death, that's where the red flags and the questions start to emerge. Forrestal's doctor at the hospital was handpicked by the Navy Surgeon General. Then if you look at Forrestal's medication regimen, which was essentially on truth serum and on insulin shock therapy. And if we just look at the side effects, for example, with amobarbital, which is the truth serum, like many drugs, obviously there's going to be a ton of side effects. However, some of the key side effects are severe confusion, poor judgment, weakness, trouble breathing, shortness of breath, loss of reflexes. It's interesting that he was getting those doses of truth serum. It would make it almost easier to subdue someone, to throw them out of a window. Then if we look at the insulin shock therapy, he was receiving pretty large amount of doses for insulin at the time, and he was getting it between the 2nd and 5th week of his treatment. And he was also getting what they called psychotherapeutic interviews. So what were they trying to extract from Forrestal if they're giving him all these drugs and putting him in these weird states of mind? And if we just examine the barbaric nature of insulin shock therapy, many of the survivors, and I quote, say, "Insulin shock therapy was the most devastating, painful, and humiliating experience they have ever had." And besides the terrible job the Navy did on investigating Forrestal's death, another really key fact is that Forrestal's guard that was watching him somehow managed to slip away from his post and to not watch him. Oh, and by the way, that guard that was supposed to be watching him, that was his second shift he's ever pulled, and he wrote negative things about Forrestal's condition, while all the other guards that pulled 30, 40, 50 shifts with Forrestal were writing positive things about Forrestal, saying patient is getting better, patient is in good moods, while this new guard, who just happens to be there when Forrestal dies, was writing negative things, almost laying the foundation, setting that stage for Forrestal being the classic case of a suicide. James Forrestal's brother, Henry Forrestal, also believes that his brother was murdered, and he thinks his brother was murdered by communists. Multiple times Henry Forrestal tried to get his brother out of the hospital, multiple times, and was consistently denied until Henry Forrestal decided to threaten the hospital with going to the newspapers, making it public that his brother was being held prisoner. Henry Forrestal was making train reservations, hotel bookings, because he was trying to get his brother out of there, because he knew what was happening to him. With all the information that we have about who James Forrestal was, being an anti-communist, regarded the most anti-communist person in the country, constantly voicing his opinion on being anti-communist, news media being against him, people in our government, presidents being against James Forrestal, it's pretty clear that he was an obvious target for the communists to assassinate, because he was a threat and he knew too much, most likely. Now, what really raises the questions are his death. His death is the most questionable piece about this story, because the Navy did a terrible job investigating. The suicide doesn't make any sense. The documents from the corpsmen, the guards, and the nurses don't make any sense. I'll leave you with a quote from the great James Forrestal. Communists will never cease trying to destroy all representative government. Loyal 9 out.